this, let's bring in Sharon Seah, Coordinator and Senior Fellow of the ASEAN Studies Centre, ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute. Well, thanks for joining us this evening, Sharon. First up, I thought we'll start with a big picture question. As ASEAN leaders met with their US as well as East Asian counterparts, were there any surprises or notable outcomes that you've observed from those conversations they've had?
So there's no geopolitical black swan event. I think Laos can heave a great sigh of relief, but geopolitics continued to dominate those meetings. And we can see from there that the intractable positions over Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Hamas, Myanmar and South China Sea continue to be unresolved among ASEAN member states as well as between ASEAN and its partners.
Right. Those issues, like South China Sea, it's a very complex situation. But I thought I'd bring our attention to the Philippine President Marcos's public challenge over the South China Sea tensions at the ASEAN summit. And what impact do you think this would have on ASEAN's collective stance on the issue?
Yeah, the South China Sea is always the elephant in the room, isn't it? So President Marcos raised the issue of the tense situation during the 27th ASEAN-China Summit, and several of the ASEAN member states spoke up about this issue as well. So I think it really, I won't call it a public challenge per se. Where else could President Marcos have raised it except at the ASEAN-China Summit? I think it does betray the Philippines' frustration at the situation. ASEAN itself is also worried about a possible outbreak, whether accidental, intended or not, in the South China Sea, and has found itself unable or even unwilling to intervene. So instead, the focus for ASEAN has been almost solely on the negotiations of the Code of Conduct. But I think we shouldn't just pay attention to only what President Marcos said at the start. He also said at the end of his intervention that the Philippines commits itself to deepening and expanding ASEAN-China relations in a comprehensive manner. So I think we can take comfort perhaps in that Philippines is trying to take a very holistic view of this.
And in terms of negotiations on the Code of Conduct, where are we now at this point?
Well, we are still negotiating it. Unfortunately, we haven't heard very much in terms of progress in there. There are several issues that's holding it back. But ASEAN's not giving up. ASEAN is still, plodding along and hoping that we can get a resolution to the Code of Conduct very soon.
Right, and as these countries are raising their issues with the Chinese Premier Li Qiang, right? He's sort of been saying that let's blame the external forces for interfering in regional affairs. And I'm wondering, Sharon, how would you interpret that statement?
I think this kind of framing of developments taking place at the behest of certain external powers is actually code for the US and its allies, saying that Southeast Asians are continuing to act in certain ways at their behest. But Southeast Asia is no longer a battleground for external powers, and neither are its countries' proxies. So this is an outdated Cold War view of the region being played around by the powers. And this view belittles ASEAN's agency and autonomy in its own regional affairs. ASEAN has been forging its path to peace and stability since 1967. It uses a mixture of diplomatic, political, and economic cooperation intra-regionally, also extra-regionally. I think we can safely say that ASEAN has a track record in deciding how and when it wants to engage with external partners. For instance, in the way that it paved the way to the Paris Accords of 1991, and how ASEAN welcomed its former foe, Vietnam, into the fold. I think this speaks for itself.
What then do you make of the new Japanese Prime Minister, Ishida? He's proposed this Asian NATO for collective security. I'm wondering how feasible do you think it is, considering, ASEAN has traditionally emphasized about being neutral?
Yeah, the Japanese Prime Minister's controversial suggestion of an Asian NATO actually prompted strong reactions from around the region. There is little risk appetite for collective security in the way that NATO functions. The question is security against who or against what? Back in 1954, there was an attempt to create a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization called SEATO, comprising the US, UK, France, and several Southeast Asian countries, and that was to counter the ideological spread of communism. But SEATO didn't survive, and you can tell that by that, right, ASEAN countries would be very wary of any actions relations that can be perceived as containing any particular country. So I would say this idea really wouldn't fly with the ASEAN leaders.
Good to know, Sharon. I want to move on and talk about ASEAN trade because there are some numbers here I want to share that ASEAN's trade with China actually skyrocketed from 235 billion to nearly 700 billion last year alone. That's quite a big jump. Do you think then the bloc can actually somehow leverage this strong economic relationship to push for better terms on or concessions on regional security issues, for instance?
ASEAN and China, as you rightly pointed out, they are actually each other's largest trading partners. We have a very mature economic relationship with China. So we are expecting that there will be an ASEAN-China FTA 3.0 next year. China is also engaged in the RCEP, and China has applied to join the CPTPP. So that relationship is very strong, right? But insofar as leveraging, I don't think the bloc has succeeded in leveraging this relationship for greater regional stability. A collective unified stance on engagement with China is simply not there, as evidenced by the different positions we talked about in the South China Sea. And some smaller ASEAN member states may fear bilateral economic repercussions, or some may not even have, connected the dots with the regional security issues yet. So I think there's a lot that can be done. There's certainly leverage, but it's up to ASEAN whether they want to pull those levers.
Right, let's just move on to Malaysia because, it's getting ready to take on the ASEAN chairmanship. So Sharon, what do you think its top priorities should be to move the region forward, or do you think it's going to be same old, same old?
As we were talking, the theme has been released. Malaysia's theme is inclusivity and sustainability. There are high expectations of Malaysia, it being a founding member, and Prime Minister Anwar himself, an experienced hand in international affairs. So the first priority, I think, would be to set ASEAN's house in order, strengthen ASEAN unity. I mean, many of these issues that is intractable is really because of the lack of unity. And the most immediate issue for the bloc is the ongoing Myanmar crisis. Malaysia will have to find a viable pathway to bring all the parties to the table on this issue, because Myanmar's troubles are affecting unity, and also it can spill over to regional security for the region. So this is the only way for ASEAN to be relevant, is to be relevant to itself by solving this internal challenge. And also not forgetting the issue of the Rohingya refugees will be important to Malaysia as well. And the second one is actually to maintain centrality, right? I mean, we've been talking about centrality for the longest time in external relations. I think in that respect, Malaysia have to balance ASEAN's economic relationship with China, as we also talked about earlier, and the security concerns that's going on in the South China Sea. Itself being a claimant state to the South China Sea, and also being cognizant of other ASEAN member states' concerns in that area, I think Malaysia will have to balance between defending ASEAN's interests vis-a-vis its own interest in stronger ties with China. And the last one is to accelerate the pace of economic integration, of course, by concluding the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, upgrading the FTAs, various FTAs, and articulating an ASEAN post-2025 vision.
Well, it sounds like Malaysia has a lot to do in order to set the house in order. Thanks so very much for sharing. Sharon Seah from the ASEAN Studies Centre at ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute.